Hello and welcome to my presentation of my empirical research on draft busts from 2001 to 2010. My name is Kirk Dahlke. I'm a statistics student here at UWL, and I will be going into my final semester in the fall. I hope you enjoy this presentation. To begin with, a few clarifications will be helpful before I begin explaining my research. The first clarification is explaining what a bust is. A bust in the NFL is considered a player who fails to meet the expectations that were set for them after they were drafted. Typically, a player is not considered a bust in the second round because they were only expected to be a role player at tops. And even if they don't make the team, people still tend to not really think of them as busts. Even players after the top 10 picks in the draft that don't pan out don't really get a ton of attention as a bust. However, they are typically still considered busts. For my purposes, I only looked at players in the top 10 picks of the draft. In my research, I needed to find a numeric way to decide who was and was not a bust. It wasn't good enough to simply look at a player's stats and make the call myself because I don't believe I could have done that and judged an offensive lineman in the same way I would judge a quarterback. As a result, I looked for a measure that was not biased towards any position. The metric I ended up using was the seasons as primary starter statistic in Pro Football Reference. For my cutoff to be a bust, I chose to use 4 years or less as a primary starter to determine if players were busts. I chose 4 years because it was a short enough time to not be biased against positions that may have a shorter span of good years, and because teams would expect players to make a long-term impact, and there's little room for argument that 4 years is a long-term impact for the NFL. Finally, how does my research fit into past draft research? Well, the NFL draft has been thoroughly investigated to attempt to find a consistent way to discover players that are and are not busts. As a result, pieces of data that would make a lot of sense to be able to correlate between busts have been investigated inside and out. These are metrics such as that of the Combine, Wonderlic scores, and of course, college statistics. Unfortunately, nobody has found a consistent way of knowing who would and would not be a bust. My research looks to explore a new avenue that has only been looked at in a broader sense. My hope is to find evidence to support that at least one of the topics I researched found a significant relationship between busts to create a platform that will allow for future research. Of course, what are my topics of research? The topics I investigated for my analysis were which teams drafted the player in order to see if perhaps organizations are failing to develop players, and that is why there are busts. Which position is busting, in order to see if there are specific positions that tend to not perform to expectations when they are drafted in the top 10. How many college games the players played in. This is to see if small sample size leads to players not being ready for the NFL. The reason for the busting, in order to separate the busts into two categories, which were performance busts and injury busts, so that two separate analyses could be run for the later tests. And of course, the NFL seasons played as a starter, as this is my bust criteria, and how I measured the relationship of college games played to how the busts perform in the NFL. The way that I went about analyzing the bust was through the chi-square goodness of fit test and the simple linear regression model. For teams and positions, I used the chi-square method to compare expected number of busts if each team had the same proportion of busts compared to players drafted and the observed number of busts that actually occurred. After that, I went over to the college games played and the NFL seasons as primary starter, and I separated them into players who busted due to performance and players who busted due to injury. Then I ran the simple linear regression model twice on both versions with college games as my independent variable and seasons as primary starter as my dependent variable. The results are as follows. This is the results of the chi-square goodness of fit test for teams. In the bottom right of the chi-square test statistic column, the total sum of the individual teams is added together for the test statistic, which in this one is 14.93. I then used my degrees of freedom of 27, since only 28 teams picked in the top 10 in the span of 2001 to 2010, and used the chi-square table to find the rejection region. This showed us that our test statistic was not in the rejection region, so we failed to reject, leading to the conclusion that the proportion of busts drafted was not significantly different between the teams. Next, we can look at the positions chi-square data and see that the rejection region is once again larger than the test statistic, leading us to failing to reject that the position of the player has a difference in proportion compared to other positions. After that, we move to the simple linear regression tests. The first one we are going to look at is for players who failed due to performance. We were hoping to see a positive correlation between college games and years as a starter, but unfortunately no relation appears to exist based off of the correlation coefficient, which is the value underneath the R-squared data, in this case is 0.001, and then the significance of the p-value, which tells us that there is not significant evidence to support that the slope of the regression line is 0. Finally, we look at the relationship between players who busted because they were injured, and we find once again the correlation is not significant and that there is no significant evidence that the actual slope is 0. Unfortunately, no relationships between busts were discovered within my examination of the data. However, that does not mean that relationships do not exist. There were some factors that limited and may have even biased the data that I used. To begin with, the data itself made it difficult to gather information as simple as how many college games that a player played in. In addition, some of the topics that I wished to investigate I found unrealistic to investigate because they simply hadn't started keeping track of that information until more recently. For one, draft rankings and where players were projected to go were done back in the early 2000s, but the actual rankings were really not published in a way that were easily accessible online. Another significant limitation was that I used a small sample size. Using more players in the draft is nice, but there's a risk that a player at 32 is considered the same amount of a bust as a player at 1. Then looking at more draft classes would also help, but if players still have a chance to get back in the league, the data is also just a little bit scuffed. Finally, my metric for who was and was not a bust was not perfect. There is a lot more that can be done to investigate who is and who is not a bust. Something like using 5 years instead of 4 years may be a more suitable method, but it was up to me on where I felt comfortable with drawing the line, and I placed it at 4. To wrap up, I wanted to make a connection to the course in which I'm doing this research for. While draft research is interesting, the overarching reasons for teams wanting to make the right choice and wanting to know who was a bust is ultimately because they want the player that will bring in the most economic benefit from a business perspective. Getting the best player gives teams greater success, and success is the avenue to revenue. When a star quarterback is drafted, their jersey sells wonderfully, people want to see the game, nobody is calling for the people making the draft decisions to be fired, the media is giving the team extra attention to highlight that player, but all of this is at the cost of eventually that player has to be paid, and is going to be a mark against the salary cap. And it's the team's job to keep a balance on who they have on busts and booms in the draft. Thank you for listening to my presentation.